Welcome to Chapter 11. Chapter 11 is all about project risk management. Just as kind of a side note, we also teach another course at the university for IT security and risk management. It's kind of sort of similar to this topic. And one of the things we talk about is risk management is not risk elimination, right? We're not trying to make no risks. We're trying to manage risks, right? Okay, just elimination is kind of a bridge too far. Okay, so let's start with the learning objectives. So understand risk and the importance of good project risk management. Discuss the elements of planning. List common sources of risk. Describe the process of identifying and creating a risk register. Discuss the qualitative analysis. Explain quantitative risk analysis. Provide examples of using different types of risk responses, how to control risk, and how software can assist. So this kind of starts the same way. Okay, so there's an opening case as always, and so this case is about a company who's trying to bid on contracts. Okay, and so they're a growing IT consultant company, and they have lots of people, and they're planning on hiring a lot more people, but they're spending an awful lot of time preparing responses to RFPs, the bidding process where the company asks for a request for proposal, you prepare a proposal and send it in, and you may or may not get the bid. Okay. And he's been focusing on big, high dollar contracts. And unfortunately, he hasn't been winning that many. So he ends up spending an awful lot of time working on bids. If you spend 50% of your time working on bids, but you don't get any contracts, first of all, it's not very much fun. And you're not making any money. So a lot of people are thinking about leaving because there's all they're doing is doing bid proposals. Okay. So starting on page 426, they talk about the importance of risk management. So first of all, risk management is kind of halfway art and halfway science. I mean, clearly there's not just a single way to look at how to manage risk, and there's an awful lot of personalities involved. Some people are, risk averse and they don't want to take any risks at all. And other people are they love risk and they go for it every single time. So, it really kind of depends. And one of the odd things is, your company may be pointing down one path and then you have a change in management. Some CEO or something happens and then all of a sudden, whoop, you whip around to the other side. It's like, whoa, we're now doing that? Okay. So it's a little weird. Okay. They talk about that risk. Don't think of risk as negative. Most people, when they talk about risk, in fact, the classical definition of risk, talks about, some sort of a probability of injury or that kind of thing, But in their interpretation, risk is something that's unknown. So it's just a matter of uncertainty. It could be uncertainty that you're going to win a contract and make a lot of money, or lose a contract and not make any money. So in their point of view, risk is both positive and negative. That's kind of weird. All right. So it can have a positive effect if, like when you're selecting projects to bid on, that would be a good time to think about risk, determining the scope of a project, and then, I'm going to get realistic cost estimates and schedule estimates. Yeah, you need to be thinking about risk during those periods of time to make sure that you're not going to end up with a disappointment. Okay. Now, a lot of the problems is if you're very, very good at doing risk management, no one can see it. It's one of those weird scenarios where, now, if you fail, okay, if something goes horribly wrong and you're into crisis mode, you can see crisis management. You can see people, you did a pretty good job of cleaning up after this disaster. But no one sees, hey, that worked pretty good. Or your cost estimate was spot on. I mean, no one sees that, okay? So it's kind of weird. Being very, very good at risk management means that no one ever sees it. Okay, let's continue. So risk management is as a measure of the project's maturity. We've kind of seen this maturity model before, where companies can be kind of rate themselves on maturity. So here's industry types. So here's engineering and construction. And here's how well they actually do. So, for example, in engineering construction, the lowest quality the lowest maturity rating is probably on the quality of their work. Risk, one of the many items here, 2.9, that's not terrible. But telecommunications people, they kind of do pretty good. They're kind of in the 3s, except for risk. Information, they're kind of sort of in the 3s, except for risk and a few other things. And whatever, high-tech manufacturing kind of stuff, they're okay. But everyone does a poor job of doing risks. Isn't that crazy? Now let's go look at who has the lowest in the risk category. It's IT. Yeah. So, information systems tend to have the lowest maturity score when it comes to risk. Now, some of this is just due to the nature that engineering and construction, you're building a bridge, you're building a house. It's been done 1,000 times, and so your risk is kind of small. Information systems, I'm building a brand new something, and it might not work. And so there's inherently higher risks in IT. Okay. But how well this is not a measure of the industry by type. This is how they rated the maturity of risk management. Okay. So, maturity ratings do have a very high correlation to project success. Those companies, I wish they had like a summary down at the bottom, but if your company is like a 3 or 3.5 on the maturity rating, you're probably going to be a very successful company. If you're a 2 or 2.5, you're probably not going to be a very successful company. Okay, just saying. All right. So, there's some interesting stats. There's a bullet list on page 427 that kind of rolls this up. There's some cool stats in here. One is that 97% of the people that were surveyed had some sort of a risk management plan. Okay, that's pretty good. That's kind of amazing. 80% said that avoiding problems was the major benefit. Okay, so thinking ahead and what could possibly go wrong and trying to avoid those things, that's what they think the major benefit is of having a risk management plan. 70% had defined software processes where, okay, we're going to do the software, we're going to do step this, step that, step that. And then 64% had some sort of a project management office. So if you're big enough, you can probably have a dedicated office for doing, project management stuff. So there's a survey talking about the benefits. So here is what most people think the benefits are of doing risk management. Well, number one is to be able to anticipate and avoid problems. Yeah. To prevent surprises, to improve the ability to negotiate customer commitments, reduce schedule slips, reduce cost overruns. Okay, so these are legitimate. Let me just give you a framework for this. Let's say, for example, that you're okay, I'm going to use a different example other than IT. But, you're a car manufacturer in Italy, and the auto union in Italy goes on strike at the drop of a hat. And so you need to kind of be thinking about this. Okay, I'm trying to produce this car, but, my relations with my labor force isn't that great, and, they really could throw a real monkey wrench into this thing by going on strike. That's a risk that you need to be thinking about. You need some contingency plan, some way to anticipate, maybe not avoid, but anticipate the problem. Okay. All right, so that's just an example. Okay. So there's a sidebar on page 429 called Global Issues. It's actually pretty decent. You probably need to take the time just to read that. It talks about, there was an entire economic downturn when we had our housing crisis in 2008, the mortgage crisis. It took a lot of banks down, right? And one of the reasons it took banks down is because banks and mortgage companies were taking lots of risks. And so basically the government had to step in and say, you can't have this much risk if your assets are only this much. So they basically capped how risky they can do things. Now, I will tell you that things have changed since then, and the Federal Trade Commission and the banking regulations are trying to dial back some of those restrictions. But the idea was that these companies were taking on too much risk. So they couldn't survive a problem. If you had a default on this, it would take the whole bank down. What's the health of a bank is all about the risk. That's how you would measure that. Okay. So risk management starts with risk identification. I cannot possibly manage risk if I don't even know what the heck the risks are. Right? Kind of makes sense. So you can't predict in the IT security risk management course. We talk about I can't protect an asset if I don't know it exists. Okay, same thing here. So the classical definition, as I mentioned, is the possibility of injury or loss. That's the classical definition, but we're not using that because we're talking about both positive and negative outcomes. So risk means, could mean good things, could mean bad things. Cool. So the new definition that the book uses is uncertainty that can have either a positive or negative impact on a project. Okay, so that's a pretty decent definition. Okay. Now, doing risk management requires people, and people cost money. All right, so back to the IT security risk course. Let's say you have a particular information asset that's worth $5,000. Okay, that's how much this thing is worth, whatever the information is. You don't want to spend $10,000 protecting something that costs $5,000, right? That doesn't make good sense. So same thing here. Risk management costs money. I mean, you got to have a staff, you got to pay people, and so whatever that cost is, a couple $100,000 for salaries and all the rest of the incidentals, then what you be doing should have an impact greater than that, right? In other words, the swing in the pendulum has to be greater than the cost. Okay, kind of sort of makes sense. So just to put it succinctly, it should not exceed the whatever the impact would be. And here they definitely are talking about negative because it's perfectly well, maybe not. Yeah, if I spend $10,000, I can get this $5,000 contract. Okay, yeah. Okay, so there's some terms here that kind of make sense. One is called the risk appetite. So this is just a degree of uncertainty, and I mentioned that not everyone has the same risk appetite. So companies, the individuals, particularly like CEOs and folks that are in power, or just the organizational culture of a company, kind of determine on where they are on the scale of we like to take lots of risks or we like to take no risks at all. Okay. Consider some industries, for example, let's say you're in the stock market. If you're a stockbroker, where are you on the scale of risk? They tend to be more risk-taking because there's lots of reward with risks. Okay. So not everyone has the same threshold, right? So swap out a CEO, you might have trouble. Risk tolerance. This is the maximum amount of acceptable deviation from what you would expect. I expect this, and so here's how much I'm willing to accept as deviation. That's my maximum allowable. That's my risk tolerance. Risk utility. Now, utility sounds kind of weird, but basically what they're talking about here, what's the maximum amount of payoff? Once again, if I spend $5,000 preparing this bid, I'm going to get $10,000 in rewards, okay? So the risk utility is basically the monetary effect of the outcome. Okay, we're coming up on the 15-minute mark, so this is probably a good place to pause. See you guys soon.